Character is a typically English word. Apart from the English, few nations have laid such stress on character in their ideal of education and manhood as the Chinese. The Chinese seem to be so preoccupied with it that in their whole philosophy they have not been able to think of anything else. Totally devoid of any extra mundane interest, and without getting involved in any religious claptrap, this ideal of building of character has, through the influence of their literature, the theater, and proverbs, permeated to the lowliest peasant and provided him with a philosophy of life. But while the English word character suggests strength, courage, guts, and looking merely glum in moments of anger and or disappointment, the Chinese word for character brings us the vision of a mature man of mellow temperament, retaining an equanimity of mind under all circumstances, with a complete understanding not only of himself but of his fellow man. The Sung philosophy has a tremendous confidence in the power and supremacy of the mind over emotions, and an overweening assurance that the human mind, through its understanding of oneself and of one's fellow men, is able to adjust itself to the most unfavorable circumstances and triumph over them. The Great Learning, the Confucian primer with which Chinese schoolboys used to begin their first lesson at school, defines the Great Learning as consisting of the attainment of a clear character, which is almost an impossible English expression, but by which it is meant the illumination of understanding, developed and cultivated through knowledge. A mellow understanding of life and of human nature is and always has been the Chinese ideal of character, and from that understanding other qualities are derived, such as pacifism, contentment, calm, and strength of endurance, which distinguish the Chinese character. Strength of character is really strength of the mind, according to the Confucianists. When a man has cultivated these virtues through mental discipline, we say he has developed his character. Very often these virtues are attained also through the help of Confucian fatalism. For contrary to the general belief, fatalism is a great source of peace and contentment. A beautiful and talented girl may rebel against an unsuitable marriage, but if the peculiar circumstances of her meeting with her fiancé can convince her that it is the gods who have decreed the match, she can at once, through an act of understanding, become a happy and contented wife. For the husband has in her eyes become a predestined enemy, and the Chinese proverb says, predestined enemies will always meet in a narrow alleyway. With that understanding, they can love and fight each other furiously ever after, knowing all the time that the gods are looking on and causing them all this trouble. If we review the Chinese race and try to picture their national characteristics, we shall probably find the following traits of character: sanity, simplicity, love of nature, patience, indifference, old roguery, fecundity, industry, frugality, love of family life, pacifism, contentment, humor, conservatism, and sensuality. They are on the whole simple, great qualities that would adorn any nation. Some of these characteristics are vices rather than virtues, and others are neutral qualities. They are the weakness as well as the strength of the Chinese nation. Too much mental sanity often clips imagination of its wings and deprives the race of its moments of blissful madness. Pacifism can become a vice of cowardice, and patience, again, may bring about a morbid tolerance of evil. Conservatism may at times be a mere synonym for sloth and laziness, and fecundity may be a racial virtue but an individual vice. But all these qualities may be summed up in the word mellowness. They are passive qualities, suggestive of calm and passive strength rather than of youthful vigor and romance. They suggest the qualities of a civilization built for strength and endurance rather than for progress and conquest. For it is a civilization which enables a man to find peace under any circumstances, and when a man is at peace with himself, he cannot understand the youthful enthusiasm for progress and reform. It is the old culture of an old people who know life for what it is worth and do not strive for the unattainable. Supremacy of the Chinese mind flays its own hopes and desires, and by making the supreme realization that happiness is an unattainable bluebird and giving up the quest for it, taking a step backwards, as the Chinese expression goes, it finds happiness nestling in its own hand, almost strangled to death during the hot pursuit of an imagined shadow. As a Ming scholar puts it, by losing that pawn, one wins the whole game. This so-called mellowness is the result of a certain type of environment. In fact, all national qualities have an organic unity which finds its explanation in the kind of social and political soil that nourishes them, for mellowness somehow grows naturally out of the Chinese environment as a peculiar variety of pears grows out of its soil. There are American-born Chinese, brought up in a different environment, who are totally devoid of the characteristics of the common Chinese and who can break up a faculty meeting by the sheer force of their uncouth nasal twang and their direct, forceful speech, a speech which knows no fine modulations. They lack that supreme, unique mellowness peculiar to the sons of Cathay. On the other hand, Chinese college youths are considerably more mature than American students of the same age, for even young Chinese freshmen in American universities cannot get interested in football and motor cars. They have already other and more mature interests. Most probably they are already married. They have a wife and a family to think about, their parents to remember, and perhaps some cousins to help through school. Responsibility makes men sober, and a national cultural tradition helps them to think sanely about life at a period earlier than they could arrive at it individually. But their mellowness does not come from books, it comes from a society which is apt to laugh young enthusiasm out of court. The Chinese have a certain contempt for young enthusiasm and for new brooms that will sweep this universe clean, by laughing at that enthusiasm and at the belief that everything is possible in the world. Chinese society early teaches the young to hold their tongues while their elders are speaking. Very soon the Chinese youth learns this, and instead of being foolish enough to support any proposed scheme or socialistic venture, he learns to comment unfavorably upon it, pointing out all the possible difficulties, and in that way gets his pass into mature society. Then after coming back from Europe or America, he begins to manufacture toothpaste and calls it saving the country by industrialization, or he translates some American free verse and calls it introduction of Western culture. And since he has usually a big family to support and some cousins for whom to secure positions, he cannot remain a school teacher if he is in the teaching profession, but must think of ways and means to rise higher, perhaps become a dean, and in that way become a good member of his family. That process of trying to rise higher teaches him some memorable lessons of life and human nature, and if he escapes all that experience and remains a round-eyed, innocent, hot-headed young man at 30, still enthusiastic for progress and reform, he is either an inspired idiot or a confounded genius. Let us take the three worst and most striking characteristics: patience, indifference, and old roguery, and see how they arose. I believe that these are effects of culture and environment, and hence are not necessarily a part of the Chinese mental makeup. They are here today because for thousands of years we have been living under certain cultural and social influences. The natural inference is that when these influences are removed, the qualities will also correspondingly diminish or disappear. The quality of patience is the result of racial adjustment to a condition where overpopulation and economic pressure leave very little elbow room for people to move about, and is in particular a result of the family system, which is a miniature of Chinese society. Indifference is largely due to the lack of legal protection and constitutional guarantee for personal liberty. Old roguery is due, for lack of a better word, to the Taoist view of life. Of course, all these qualities are products of the same environment, and it is only for the sake of clearness that one assigns any single cause for any resulting quality. That patience is a noble virtue of the Chinese people, no one who knows them will gainsay. There is so much of this virtue that it has almost become a vice with them. The Chinese people have put up with more tyranny, anarchy, and misrule than any Western people will ever put up with, and seem to have regarded them as part of the laws of nature. In certain parts of Sichuan, the people have been taxed 30 years in advance without showing more energetic protest than a half-audible curse in the privacy of the household. Christian patience would seem like petulance compared with Chinese patience, which is as unique as Chinese blue porcelain is unique. The world tourists would do well to bring home with them some of this Chinese patience along with Chinese blue porcelain, for true individuality cannot be copied. We submit to tyranny and extortion as small fish swim into the mouth of a big fish. Perhaps had our capacity for sufferance been smaller, our sufferings would also be less. As it is, this capacity for putting up with insults has been ennobled in the name of patience and deliberately inculcated as a cardinal virtue by Confucian ethics. I am not saying that this patience is not a great quality of the Chinese people. Jesus said, "Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth," and I am not sure, but that Chinese patience has enabled us to inherit half a continent and keep it. The Chinese also inculcate it consciously as a high moral virtue. As our saying goes, a man who cannot tolerate small ills can never accomplish great things. The training school for developing this virtue is, however, the big family, where a large number of daughters-in-law, brothers-in-law, fathers, and sons daily learn this virtue by trying to endure one another. In the big family, where a closed door is an offense and where there is very little elbow room for the individuals, one learns by necessity and by parental instruction from early childhood the need for mutual toleration and adjustments in human relationships. The deep, slow, everyday wearing effect on character can scarcely be overestimated. There was once a Prime Minister, Chang Kung-yi, who was much envied for his earthly blessedness of having 9 generations living together under the same roof. Once the Emperor Tang Kaosheng asked him the secret of his success, and the minister asked for a brush and paper on which he wrote 100 times the character patience or endurance. Instead of taking that as a sad commentary on the family system, the Chinese people have ever after envied his example, and the phrase 100 patience, Fujian, has passed into current moral proverbs which are written on red paper and posted on all house doors on New Year's Day. Peaceableness brings good luck, patience is the best family heritage, etc. But so long as the family system exists and so long as society is built on the principle that a man is not an individual but attains his full being only in living in harmonious social relationships, it is easy to see how patience must be regarded as a supreme virtue and must grow naturally out of the social system, for in such a society patience has a reason for existence. But if the Chinese people are unique in their patience, they are still more justly famous for their indifference. This, again, I believe, is a product of social environment. There is no more significant contrast than that between the parting instruction of Tom Brown's mother in the English classic Tom Brown's School Days to hold his head high and answer straight, and the traditional parting instruction of the Chinese mother and her son should not meddle with public affairs. This is so because in a society where legal protection is not given to personal rights, indifference is always safe and has an attractive side to it difficult for Westerners to appreciate. I think this indifference is not a natural characteristic of the people, but is a conscious product of our culture, deliberately inculcated by our old world wisdom under the special circumstances. Taine once said that vice and virtue are products like sugar and vitriol. Without taking such an absolute view, one can nevertheless subscribe to the general statement that any virtue will be more generally encouraged in a society where that virtue is easily seen to be good and is more likely to be generally accepted as part of life. The Chinese people take to indifference as Englishmen take to umbrellas because the political weather always looks a little ominous for the individual who ventures a little too far out alone. In other words, indifference has a distinct survival value in China. Chinese youths are as public-spirited as foreign youths, and Chinese hotheads show as much desire to meddle with public affairs as those in any other country, but somewhere between their 25th and their 30th years, they all become wise. Shui Kuai Liao, as we say, and acquire this indifference which contributes a lot to their mellowness and culture. Some learn it by native intelligence, others by getting their fingers burned once or twice. All old people play safe because all old rogues have learned the benefits of indifference in a society where personal rights are not guaranteed and where getting one's fingers burned once is bad enough. The survival value of indifference consists, therefore, in the fact that in the absence of protection of personal rights, it is highly unsafe for a man to take too much interest in public affairs, or idle affairs, as we call them. When Xiao Piaoping and Lin Poshui, two of our most daring journalists, got shot by a Manchurian warlord in Peiping in 1926, without even a trial, the other journalists naturally learned the virtue of this indifference in no time and became wise. The most successful journalists in China are those who have no opinion of their own. Like all Chinese gentlemen, and like the Western diplomats, they are proud of committing themselves to no opinion on life in general and on the crying question of the hour in particular. What else can they do? One can be public-spirited when there is a guarantee for personal rights and one's only outlook is the libel law. When these rights are not protected, however, our instinct of self-preservation tells us that indifference is our best constitutional guarantee for personal liberty. In other words, indifference is not a high moral virtue, but a social attitude made necessary by the absence of legal protection. It is a form of self-protection, developed in the same manner as the tortoise develops its shell. The famous Chinese apathetic gaze is only a self-protective gaze acquired by a lot of culture and self-discipline. This is borne out by the fact that Chinese robbers and bandits who do not depend upon legal protection do not develop this indifference, but are the most chivalrous and public-spirited. Class of people we know in China. Chinese chivalry, under the name of Hao Xia, is invariably associated with the robbers as Shui Hu. The vicarious pleasure derived in reading the life of adventures of such heroes accounts for the popularity of such novels in the same way that Eleanor Glynn's popularity was to be accounted for by the large number of old maids in the United States. Strong, therefore, are public-spirited because they can afford to be so, and the meek who constitute the majority of people are indifferent because they need to protect themselves. Historically, this could be strikingly proved in the history of the Wei and Qin dynasties, when scholars became admired for their indifference to national affairs, resulting soon in the sapping of national strength and the conquest of North China by barbarians. It was the fashion for scholars of the Wei and Qin dynasties to give themselves up to drinking, light conversation, Qing Tan, and dreaming about Taoist fairies and discovering the pill of immortality. This period seemed to be politically the lowest period of the Chinese race since the Zhou and Han times, representing the end of a progressive degeneration of the race until, for the first time in its history, China was submerged under barbarian rule. Was this cult of indifference natural? And if not, how was it brought about? History reveals this to us in no uncertain terms. Toward the end of the Han Dynasty, the Chinese scholars were not indifferent. In fact, political criticism was at its height during this period. Leading scholars and university students numbering over 30,000 were often embroiled over questions of current politics and dared the wrath of the eunuchs and the emperor in their intrepid attacks on government policies or the conduct of members of the imperial household. Yet, because of the absence of constitutional protection, this movement ended in complete suppression at the hands of the eunuchs. 200 or 300 scholars and sometimes their whole families were sentenced to death, exile, or imprisonment. This occurred in the years AD 166 to 169 and was known as the Tangku, or party cases. This was carried out in such a thorough fashion and on such a grand scale that the whole movement was cut short, and its remaining effects were felt for over a century afterward. Then came the reaction and the cult of indifference and the developing crazes for wine, women, poetry, and Taoist occultism. Some of the scholars went into the mountains and built themselves mud houses without a door, receiving their food through a window till their death. Others disguised themselves as woodcutters and begged their relatives to save them from recognition by refraining from making calls. Immediately after that came the 7 poets of the Lady of the Bamboo Grove. Liu Ling, a great poet, could go on a drunken fit for months. He used to travel on a cart with a jug of wine, a shovel, and a gravedigger, giving the latter the order as they started, "Bury me when I am dead, anywhere, anytime." People admired him and called him clever. All scholars affected either extreme rusticity or extreme sensuality and extreme superficiality. Another great poet, Yuan Xian, had illicit relations with his maid. When he learned at a public feast that his wife had sent the maid away, he immediately borrowed a horse from a friend and galloped off after the maid until he overtook her and carried her back on horseback in the presence of all the guests. These were the people who became admired for their cleverness. People admired them as a small tortoise admires the thick shell of a big tortoise. Here we seem to have laid our finger on the fatal disease of the body politic, and to see the origin of that indifference which explains the proverbial inability of the Chinese people to organize themselves. It would seem that the curing of the disease is simple, by having constitutional protection for the people's civil rights. Yet no one has seen the far-reaching consequences of this. No one desires it. No one sincerely wants it.